So good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today and to join you, and I'll tell you a bit about HELCOM in general, how you can engage with HELCOM, and Evija will then take over and also give you some insights into what the current Latvian chairmanship is doing. And what that means, I will also explain to you along the way. So let's start with the basics about HELCOM. HELCOM is an international organization that was founded in 1974. It's based on the Helsinki Convention, or the Convention on the Protection of the Marine Environment of the Baltic Sea area. Why 1974, and what is this all about? Well, if you look back in history, you'll see that at the end of the 19th century, the state of the Baltic Sea was actually quite good. And in the course of the first half of the 20th century, it deteriorated rapidly. And by the second half of the 20th century, we have the doubtful or the dubious reputation of being the most polluted sea in the world. Whether or not that's entirely true may be difficult to verify, but it means that, of course, the condition of the sea had deteriorated considerably and something needed to be done. And therefore, in 1974, the then 7 countries around the Baltic Sea decided to take action. 7 countries, I'll come back to that in a minute as well. They decided to take action to protect the Baltic Sea, and this is why they then agreed on and concluded the Helsinki Convention. Now, 1974 is a significant date, actually, for 2 reasons. I always like to stress that, for 2 reasons, because on the one hand, 1974 was in the middle of the Cold War period still, and during this period, despite the ideological differences, the countries around the Baltic Sea decided to reach across this ideological divide, to reach across the Iron Curtain that was then separating Europe, and actually join efforts to try and protect the Baltic Sea. 1974 is also a significant date because in terms of international environmental law and policy, it's actually very early days. If you think back, the first UN Environment Conference, the UN Conference on the Human Environment, took place in Stockholm only in 1972. This was 2 years later. And at that point in time, none of the global conventions that we were also familiar with nowadays and take for granted, like UNFCCC, the Desertification Convention, CBD, CITES, and so on, none of those existed at the time. CITES was the first, which only entered into force in 1979. And CCC and CBD and the Desertification Convention were actually are referred to as Rio Conventions because they were adopted in 1992 at the UN Environmental Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. So none of this existed. And for those of you who are familiar with the European Union, and therefore also familiar with the very extensive environmental legislation of the European Union, I can tell you that none of that existed at that point in time either. Insofar as there was any legislation in the EU that protected the environment, it was incidental. So it was intended to do something else and then possibly also protected the environment. So these were early days in terms of international environmental policy and law, and this shows that actually the countries around the Baltic Sea were very prescient in taking this action. In 1980, the HELCOM Secretariat, that's the organization I now represent, was established. And then, of course, there were considerable geopolitical changes in the late 80s and early 90s of the last century, as well as substantive advancements in international law and policy. And on account of this, it was deemed necessary to update the convention. And this happened in 1992. By that time, we had 10 contracting parties around the Baltic Sea, 9 Baltic Sea countries, 8 of which are member states of the European Union, 1 of which Russia is not, and the European Union itself. And these 10 partners got together to then draft an updated convention, which was adopted in 1992 and entered into force in the year 2000. So it's a millennial, if you like, and this convention has been governing our work ever since. Now, I'll give you an idea of the HELCOM structure. So if you look at the slide, in the top sphere, you see the 10 contracting parties that I mentioned earlier. They decided to conclude this convention, which you see in the sphere on the left bottom of the slide. This is an instrument of international law. It is legally binding, and it is actually the only legally binding thing about HELCOM, because the decisions taken by HELCOM are not legally binding. They're so-called soft law. I'll come back to that in a minute as well. Now, having a convention is very well, but of course, you need to bring it to life. And to bring it to life, you need convention bodies. And generally, you need 3 types of bodies. You need a decision-making body. You need an implementing and coordinating body. And in some conventions, definitely, you also need advisory bodies. And that's what you see in those other two spheres, the big one, the Helsinki Commission sphere, and the HELCOM Secretariat sphere. So this is how we're structured. Our decision-making body is the Helsinki Commission, and hence the acronym HELCOM. And this decision-making body, the Helsinki Commission, exists in 3 incarnations, the highest of which is the ministerial meeting, which takes place every 3 years. The most recent one took place in 2021 in Lübeck in Germany. The next one will take place in Latvia. This is the case because we have, much like the European Union, we have changing chairmanships. In our case, it's not called presidency, but chairmanships. Chairmanships rotate among the countries in alphabetical order of their names in English. In 2021, Germany held the chairmanship. At the moment, it's Latvia, and therefore Latvia will host the next ministerial. Every 3 years is nice, but it's not good enough. Because of course, even though you can set the general direction and chart the course of the organization, if you only meet every 3 years, you can't keep things turning over, you can't keep things moving forward. So you need more frequent meetings than that. And for that reason, we also have the commission itself, the Helsinki Commission, which meets once a year, usually in March. Once a year is better than every 3 years. It still isn't good enough, and that's why we have one more level, and that's the head of delegations, which meet twice yearly, usually once in June and once in late fall, early winter, late November, or early to mid-December. This is the decision-making body. It consists of representatives of all the Baltic Sea of all the contracting parties to HELCOM. A decision-making body is important, but we at HELCOM pride ourselves in being a science-based organization. We don't take random boardroom decisions. We take decisions based on science. Since this decision-making body consists of managers, of policymakers, decision makers, we need somebody to feed the scientific knowledge into the work of this body. And I'll come back to that in a future slide. But for that reason, we also have 2 other levels within the structures, the so-called subsidiary bodies. We have working groups and expert groups. And then there's the secretariat, which you see in the central sphere of this graphic. And the secretariat does what every convention secretariat in the world does. So we prepare and service and follow up on the meetings. We draft documents. We do outreach and liaison work to keep the work of HELCOM actually moving. I will now move on to the next slide. So what's the decision-making process in HELCOM? As I said, it's a science-based approach, and it's also a bottom-up approach. So we get a mandate or an impulse to look into a specific issue, which usually comes from a contracting party. The HELCOM expert groups, which are also constituted of representatives of the various countries, but scientists, they provide the scientific and technical expertise that's needed to deal with this. This may be difficult to digest for the policymakers and managers in the commission. So we have basically an interface between the one and the other, and that's the HELCOM working groups. They then are also constituted of national experts. They're also scientists, but they have the very key and very difficult task of translating the scientific findings and technical knowledge that we have into draft recommendations, strategies, or actions. And then it moves on to the heads of delegations, which approve this work, and sometimes decisions need to be taken at a higher level. And for that, we have the annual meeting of the Helsinki Commission or the ministerial meeting. This organogram here, so we have more than one, actually shows you the structure. This is not entirely up to date because we've just actually undertaken a review of the HELCOM structure, which is not yet reflected here, but by and large it shows you how we're structured. So we have the policy making level, which is here, the Helsinki Commission and the heads of delegation. Then we have the working groups in this rectangular box, and we have the various and these square boxes. We have 8 in all, and then we have the expert groups at the bottom of this graphic. As you can see here, it says expert groups and networks, correspondence groups, ad hoc groups, and projects. That's pretty complicated, and that's why we decided to simplify it. We now have only expert groups. So that's the structure. How do we get things done? So all our work is based on the Helsinki Convention, which, as I said, is legally binding. It's an instrument of international law. Based on that, our contracting parties adopt recommendations. And these recommendations are aptly named recommendations because, as I said, that is what they are. They are not legally binding. They're politically binding. They're soft law. In other international organizations, they might be called resolutions or decisions. In our case, the contracting parties were very honest and said they are recommendations. Does that mean they're not being followed? No, it doesn't, because by and large, they are being followed, and that's how HELCOM then moves forward. And we've adopted roughly 260 of these, some of which are now obsolete, but that's quite a lot of recommendations adopted over the course of nearly 50 years of activity. In addition, we have action plans and projects, which are also key to our work. And here, I'll come back in a minute to the Baltic Sea Action Plan, which is our central program of action for everything we do. Well, all of this is very nice, except of course we also need to know whether we're actually achieving anything, and for that reason we have monitoring and assessment processes, which are also central to our work, and I'll come back to that in a minute as well. So I think have I just skipped? It seems that I've skipped the slide, which doesn't seem to be in here now. Search me. Anyway, sorry for that. What I wanted to read to you actually is the Baltic Sea vision, the HELCOM vision that we have. This vision is important because it governs our work. And that vision is a healthy Baltic Sea environment with diverse biological components functioning in balance, resulting in a good ecological status and supporting a wide range of sustainable economic and social activities. And if you listen closely to that HELCOM vision, you'll see that it encompasses all three elements of sustainable development. Now, how are we trying to achieve this? So I already gave you some insights, but our central program of action at the moment is the Baltic Sea Action Plan. And in this slide, you see two Baltic Sea Action Plans, and that's because we have two. We had a Baltic Sea Action Plan that was adopted in the year 2007 and was supposed to achieve good environmental status for the Baltic Sea by 2021. Well, we're now in 2023, and I don't need to explain to you that we don't have good environmental status, which is why we needed an update. The fact that we would miss this target of good environmental status by 2021 was apparent to the contracting parties as early as the mid-2010s, and therefore they decided that further action needed to be taken. We could have gone two ways. We could have scrapped everything and started from scratch, gone back to the drawing board, or we could have done what we did. We decided that despite shortcomings and despite the fact that it didn't achieve everything it was supposed to, the Baltic Sea Action Plan of 2007 had, in fact, attributed to ameliorating the status of the Baltic Sea and had an effect, and therefore it should be updated. And the slogan at the time was, it's going to be an evolution, not a revolution. So we decided not to reinvent the wheel, but to build on what we have. And in that process, we actually did something that we're very proud of, because I think we're still the only ones who've done it, because we actually conducted a sufficiency of measures analysis. So we had a look at where we had gotten it right, where we'd gotten it wrong, and where we were somewhere in between, and checked how and to what extent the measures we'd adopted or committed to were sufficient. The 2021 action plan is the update of the action plan adopted by the Lübeck ministerial meeting. So there you see a ministerial meeting in action in 2021. Here you see a structure of this Baltic Sea action plan, and I'll walk you through this. So at the top in the green sphere, you have the vision, which I read to you earlier. That's what we're trying to achieve, this healthy Baltic Sea with all these components and so on and so forth. The Baltic Sea Action Plan consists of 4 thematic segments dedicated to biodiversity, to hazardous substances and litter, to sea-based activities, and to eutrophication. And we have a so-called horizontal topics segment as well. And this graphic is structured the way it is because the Baltic Sea Action Plan is structured that basically each level pays onto the account of the level above. So in other words, taking it from top to bottom, to achieve the vision, we need to have a healthy Baltic Sea ecosystem. To have a healthy Baltic Sea ecosystem, we need to achieve the goals in the other thematic segments, so combat hazardous substances and litter, have sustainable sea-based activities, and combat eutrophication, which remains, even after 50 years and despite some improvements, the major pressure still affecting the Baltic Sea. And all of this, of course, also depends on progress on the horizontal topics. And these horizontal topics contain subjects as varied as the all-important funding, because all of this, of course, comes with a price tag, but also things like economic and social analysis, marine spatial planning, knowledge, building and exchange. And of course, one thing we can never forget, we always need to bear in mind, is climate change. That is an overarching subject, and that's why it's in this segment here. Now, all of this is good, but it only really helps if we can also track the progress, if we can actually see that this Baltic Sea Action Plan is achieving something. Therefore, we have ensured that this can be done. We have in the Baltic Sea Action Plan across these 5 segments 199 actions, and time and again I marvel at the fact that we didn't make 200. And frankly, even though I was involved in the process, I don't know why we stopped at 199. 200 would have been nicer. It's 199. We can make do with that. Each of these has an individual target year. The latest target year in this group is 2030, but some of these actions actually already need to be implemented now, and it's between here and 2030 that they need to be implemented. 2030, of course, was not a randomly chosen date. It was chosen also because it aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Each of these targets and each of these actions has been assigned to one or several HELCOM bodies, be it the heads of delegations, be it one of the working groups or several of the working groups. Why did we do that? Well, because this way we have ownership. So it's not just on paper and falls between the cracks because somebody forgets. We have ownership. There is at least one HELCOM body that has ownership of these various actions and needs to ensure that they're implemented. And we have specific criteria by which their achievement will be measured, and this is tracked. So we have work plans for the various groups, and we have a tool on our website that you can access, which is the HELCOM Explorer, which gives you an overview of how far we are in implementing all of this. And yes, we look at to see what the effects are, so we do monitoring and assessments. We have the Baltic Sea Action Plan. It's our central program of action, but we do more than that, of course. So we also have flanking measures to actually ensure that we get our job done. And here in these related actions, you can see some of that. So as I mentioned, eutrophication is still the single most important threat for the Baltic Sea. And to combat that, we have a nutrient recycling strategy, for instance, which should then reduce the number of nutrients introduced into the Baltic Sea. Marine litter has, in recent years, come to the fore as a significant issue, and we're aiming for a significant reduction of that by 2025, and again by 2030. We have a regional action plan for that on marine litter. We are also very conscious of land-sea interaction, of the source-to-sea continuum. The Baltic Sea is a small sea. It has 7 major rivers that actually flow into the Baltic Sea. And in fact, the operative word here is major, because there are countless smaller ones as well. And they, of course, bring with them everything that they carry. And unfortunately, that's not just water. So we realize that if we want to have a clean Baltic Sea and maintain a clean Baltic Sea, we have to look further upstream. And therefore, that's something we also do. And for instance, in 2019, we had a workshop with with river basin management authorities, which of course only the larger rivers have, but we are in constant contact with them. Underwater noise is an issue that we're aware of. We're addressing that also with a regional action plan on underwater noise. Climate change, I mentioned that before. And yes, of course, this is the overarching issue. We need to understand its effects. To do that, we teamed up with Baltic Earth, and we produced a climate change fact sheet, which is actually not aptly named because it's not a sheet, it's a book. And it shows us a lot about what we know about climate change in our region, and also a lot about what we don't know, because there's a lot we don't know. What we do know is that climate change has arrived in our region, and actually it's more severe than the global average, but there are also lots of things we don't know, and of course we need to work on that. We have a regional maritime spatial planning roadmap in conjunction, of course, with BSAP. We're working on this. We have a HELCOM science agenda. This is something I think is really, really important, because ever since Donald Rumsfeld, of course, we know that there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And we want to reduce the number of unknown unknowns and then reduce the number of unknowns altogether. And we can do that, of course, by cooperating very closely with the science community in our region, which is very vibrant and very active. And we've therefore established what the future science needs are for us to achieve a healthy Baltic Sea. And we do a lot of monitoring and assessment work. And this is where we come to HOLAS, because our key product in this regard And our flagship product, if you like, is our holistic assessments of the Baltic Sea, which we undertake periodically. We're now just in the final throes of HOLAS 3, a third holistic assessment covering the period from 2016 to 2021. And this will produce a variety of outputs. First of all, a holistic summary report, which is not yet out. Then thematic assessment reports, which are now actually being published, topic assessments, indicator report, indicator evaluations, and lots of data that we need to assess the status of the Baltic Sea to see if we're getting where we want to get. It's a holistic assessment because it covers all factors involved. So we start with drivers, activities, pressures, which lead to a certain state and an impact. And based on that, we look at the measures that need to be taken across the board of all these various areas like biodiversity, eutrophication, hazardous substances, economic and social analyses, and spatial pressures and impacts. So it is holistic because it tries to look at everything related to the Baltic Sea. And now finally, I'll come to one issue which I know is of great interest to you, because this is what we're doing, but we need you. And I know that many of you would like to assist us in doing this. And this slide gives you an idea of how this can best be done. Unfortunately, we are an international intergovernmental organization, so we're much less accessible than, for instance, an NGO would be. It's not quite as easy to interact with us as it might be with an NGO, and yet you can interact, and there are various ways of doing it. Insofar as you represent organizations, you should be aware that international non-governmental organizations, as well as intergovernmental organizations and even countries, can become observers to HELCOM, which means that they can then also participate in the meetings of HELCOM bodies. And as you will know, CCB is one of our most active observers. So this is something that can be done, and we've just gained in recent weeks 3 new observers. So that is one way how international organizations and organizations in general can cooperate with us. We do things like school and university visits. We had one just last week. This can be accommodated for relatively small groups, and you can contact the Secretariat if your university or your school is interested in knowing more about us and visiting us. You're very welcome to do that. We also offer internships we're a small secretariat. We're just between 30 and 40 people, but we do offer internships for university students. There is one caveat here. We offer paid internships, which sounds like good news in principle, except that our financial resources are very limited. So at the moment, ideally, if somebody wants to be a HELCOM intern, they are well advised to ensure that they bring funding, which some of our interns actually do. But then we'd be very happy to welcome you here also to the Secretariat. What else can you do? You can follow us on social media, and of course, please like what we do, but it's above all, share what we do. You don't necessarily have to like it. You can even criticize it, but please share what you see. And we're basically visible on all social media. So we're on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. And of course, we have a website as well where you can also find us. So that's something you can always do, and spread the news. You can, of your own accord, become a Baltic Sea champion, of course, and promote the issues we work with. You can get involved in your local NGOs. You can write your thesis on the Baltic Sea or write letters to the editor. I'm not sure how many people actually these days still read letters to the editor, but hey, I mean, it's worth a try, right? Especially if you have a good newspaper that will pick up this sort of thing. So there are many things you can do. And finally, and this is not a bad idea at all, contact your local MP. Ask him what he thinks of the Baltic Sea and what can be done for the Baltic Sea. You may be surprised one way or the other. So these are things you can do to actually promote our work, and not to promote our work, but to promote the status and the condition of the Baltic Sea. So that's what I'd like to tell you today. And sorry once again for the technical issues. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, just shortly about myself. I work in State Environmental Service of Latvia, and for the period of Latvian chairmanship, I also HELCOM chair for this 2 years period. And then also I would like to introduce in my presentation about this Latvian chairmanship of HELCOM and its priorities and challenges. And Rüdiger already told so much and so well about this HELCOM, and also touched about this chairmanship and also this principle, how it changes. So I will be very short on this as a Helsinki Commission chairmanship rotates among the 10 contracting parties, starts from the 1st of July, according to their alphabetical order in English. And the chair, it convenes and presides over the meetings of the Commission and the heads of delegations. And now this period of Latvian chairmanship started already from 1st of July last year, and it will end next year, 30th of June. And the main goal also, which coincides with HELCOM vision, which already were told in previous presentation, that the overall goals of contracting parties of the Helsinki Commission have agreed on a vision of a healthy Baltic Sea environment with rich biodiversity and resilient ecosystem, which requires a continued regional cooperation guided by the ecosystem approach. That's HELCOM vision. And to achieve that, there are several Latvian chairmanship objectives. And the first of all, it's connected to this also geopolitical situation and conditions what we have now. And it's so we have the first objective that HELCOM is an effective and well-functioning organizations of regional organizations, regional cooperation, which is capable of action, including also in foreseen or force majeure situations what we have now. And also in connection with this, the Latvian chairmanship will contribute to preparation of legal framework in line with this international law to ensure that HELCOM is able to act and also to reach its goals and to complete its tasks during also this force majeure or on foreign scene situations. And also the second part is also to work on ensure that renewed HELCOM working structure ensures implementation of the Baltic Sea Action Plan of the Helsinki Convention, which already you were introduced shortly with. Okay, and then the objective 2, it's about implementation of the Baltic Sea Action Plan, and here also we have Latvian chairmanship will pay particular attention to 2 points. One is the protection of marine biodiversity. There is, probably you have heard, there's a 30 by 30 target. That's a global also target, and it's regarding this Baltic Sea. That means that by 2030, marine protected areas covers at least 30% of the marine area of the Baltic Sea. And that's as regards this marine biodiversity. And the second part regards the sustainable use of the sea. And that means that advancing ecosystem-based sustainable marine management by integration of environmental objectives with socioeconomic goals. Also developing regional maritime spatial planning processes, taking into account climate change aspects as well. And that's shortly about objective 2. And going to objective 3 is a strengthening of the role of the regional cooperation in the context of international ocean governance. And here's a number of several international and global documents and goals. And first of all, it's of course is United Nations Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, and then is also post 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention of Biological Diversity, and other relevant regional, European, and global processes, which also is it's important to coordinate and to harmonize the work in the context of the Baltic Sea Action Plan 2021 with various political instruments of EU and also global level. And talking about this already mentioned geopolitical situation, and as you heard that the strategic pause now is in HELCOM announced, it's already starting from 4th of March, and it was in as a consequence connected with this Russia invasion in Ukraine, and then affected German chairmanship of HELCOM announced this strategic pause, and EU and contracting parties of the convention agreed that they could not currently engage in business as usual with the Russian Federation in the context of HELCOM. So their all official meetings suspended. No, so as Rüdiger already explains that not Russia is suspended, but all official meetings are suspended for this strategic pause, and also the meetings were not cancelled, but rather postponed until further notice. And also the suspension. Yes, this suspension and strategic pause is prolonged until further notice under Latvian chairmanship of HELCOM, and so we are. It doesn't imply that HELCOM as such cease operations, as also was mentioned that the work is going on and happening. Just these official meetings are suspended for this strategic pause. And also talking about the future and future main events during also Latvian chairmanship, that will be the ministerial meeting, which will be in April next year in Latvia, and also this 50th anniversary of HELCOM, and precisely speaking, that was the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Convention, which was signed in 1974, and also that's the good reason for the retrospective and a good celebration of this Baltic Sea protection for 50 years. And also important thing is the implementation of the Baltic Sea Action Plan, and as well as other commitments what is under this HELCOM umbrella. So that's very shortly about this main priorities and challenges of Latvian chairmanship.